Welcome to Standard 9E. You've finally reached the end of this very long Standard 9, and in this presentation we will assess the impact of European economic and military power on Asia and Africa. This is really an extension of 9D. In fact, I think in 9D I said it was going to be a two-part video presentation. In fact, it's actually a separate benchmark here, 9E. The essential question we're looking at for 9E, we actually have two. The first is, how did European economic and military power impact or affect Africa and Asia during this age of imperialism? Again, we're looking at a period from the mid-1800s through the mid-1900s. And then the other thing we're looking at is what were some of the responses of the colonized peoples in Africa and Asia to European imperialism. Okay, this wasn't just accepted as something that had to be accepted. There was resistance to this idea of Europeans coming and taking their land. To recap again from Standard 9D, the idea we're looking at here is that roughly 100 years ago, the world looked quite a bit different in terms of the countries you saw on the map. A large percentage of Africa and Asia was controlled by Europeans who, because of the Industrial Revolution, were in a constant quest for natural resources, along with wanting to spread their culture and to enhance their national pride. They went out and claimed these large areas of Africa and Asia, to the extent that over half of Africa and Asia were colonies of European countries a little over 100 years ago. Okay, so the essential understanding we're looking at here is we want to understand this idea that the industrialized nations of Europe, okay, and we'll also see the United States get in on this as well. They were really in a competition with one another. They were trying to control really the largest empires and the most valuable resources for their own economic and political success. Even though we read and we see examples of Europeans wanting to spread their culture because they thought it was a good thing to do, when you really get down to it, they were after the resources. They wanted to control the land for their own benefit, not for the benefits of the people that they were colonizing. Okay, the second piece of essential understanding, as we mentioned earlier, was that the people in Africa and Asia, they're not going to just accept this as a done deal. Resistance to imperialism, fighting back against imperialism, is going to take many different forms. In some cases, there's going to be armed conflict. There's going to be uprisings, rebellions, even wars, as people in Africa and Asia try to push the Europeans out of their lands. And there's also going to be intellectual movements. We're going to see political and cultural movements form throughout Africa and Asia to kind of fight the battle of ideas. Okay, not military battles, but to fight the intellectual, the thinking war against the Europeans taking over their land. Okay, so some essential knowledge, and we're really going to 4 different regions of the world here. So our first section here is imperialism in Africa. So the first piece of essential knowledge for Africa, we want to know an important meeting in history called the Berlin Conference, which was held in 1885 in the German capital of Berlin. So this was a meeting held about Africa, but it was held in Europe. And at this meeting, Africa's future fate is really decided. We can see Africa here prior to the Berlin Conference, and the different colors on the map representing the different European colonies. We notice Africa, for the most part, isn't colonized. Okay, we see some yellows and browns and purples along the coast, but the majority of Africa before the Berlin Conference was independent. Okay, traditional societies, traditional governments running the show throughout Africa. At the Berlin Conference, that's going to change. As we see in this political cartoon, the European political powers, the colonial powers, are going to gather in Berlin, and just as we see here in the cartoon, they're going to divide up Africa between them, almost as if Africa was a cake and each European country at the table was going to get a slice of Africa. We can see the effect of this meeting in a map. This is Africa in 1914, where again the colors here represent the various European colonies. Okay, we see the big change from just a few colonies along the coast to the majority of Africa being colonized by England, France, Italy, Spain, Portugal, Germany, all the major European colonial powers. To put these two maps side by side, here's the first map. We saw Africa before the Berlin Conference. Here we see Africa after the Berlin Conference. They changed up the key on this map. I never quite understood why. The only two places in Africa that escaped colonization during this period were Little Liberia here on the west coast of Africa and Ethiopia over here in East Africa. Okay, the rest of the map was all colonies of European countries at the outbreak of World War I. Okay, we can see the change here in these two pie charts. Africa in 1850, the vast majority are free and independent areas. By 1914, almost all of Africa, over 90% of Africa's land, is now European possessions, colonies of the European powers. As we'll see in class, most of imperialism, the legacy, is a negative one for Africa. The standards does point to the Suez Canal, though, as an example of something, not that it offsets the negatives of imperialism, having Africa's land and resources taken, but in terms of the world today as a positive legacy of imperialism. The Suez Canal was completed in 1869, and it linked the Mediterranean Sea to the Red Sea for the first time. Go back through history, the ancient Egyptians tried to do this, the Romans wanted to do this, lots of empires in this region looked at that little stretch of land there and said, if only water could connect the Mediterranean and the Red Sea, trade, transportation would be so much easier. We can see today the Suez Canal, what it looks like, taken from the bow of a ship, a cargo ship, and in terms of its importance, we see it there in northeastern Africa. It really cuts the distance between Europe and Asia. Okay, so let's say a product being shipped from England to India or in reverse, it really shaves about 5,000 miles off of the trip. What once was over a 12,000 mile trip is now about 7,000 miles. And again, by knocking off distance, you're saving time, you're saving money in shipping costs, and that results in cheaper products delivered faster. Okay, our second region we're going to here is India. So we want to know the following about imperialism in India. For England, and India was an area of British control. India really was, it was referred to as the crown jewel in England's empire. And yet the English had an interesting way of dealing with India. It was such a big place. There was so much going on in India that the British create a company called the East India Company. And they really let that company run India. It'd be the same, let's say in a modern example, if the president wanted the United States to go and colonize Mars. But it's just too expensive. The country really doesn't have the money for that kind of an expedition. So the president calls up McDonald's or Apple or some big company that has huge amounts of money. and says in exchange for funding the trips to Mars, you get to do commerce and trade on Mars with whoever's up there. The British established the East India Company, and they had a monopoly. They had exclusive trading rights with India. All of the products brought back to England from India were sold by the British East India Company, and they were the ones who profited from the trade. In exchange for that, the East India Company ran India on England's behalf. Okay, and we see here the seal of the British East India Company. They didn't control all of it. There were the various Indian states that remained somewhat independent. There was another thing going on. Some of these states were ruled indirectly. There was a king, or the Raj, of the states, who kind of answered to England as well. But really for over 200 years, over 250 years, the East India Company was the power in India until the series of missteps. There's a rebellion called the Sepoy Rebellion, and England takes control back from the East India Company. A little bit after this period, we see the first nationalist party formed in India, called the Indian National Congress, and they begin pushing for independence. And it's really this political party we'll see again towards the end of the course with Gandhi and in India's eventual independence from England. This political party was a big push in the direction of independence. We see the first meeting here in 1885. Okay, our third region here is China. And China is going to be divided up into spheres of influence. Again, China, a big place with a lot of resources. No one European country controls China, but they divided up between them into these spheres of influence, these basically economic colonies. Each color there on the map represents a European country, or in the case of Japan, a non-European country, who was granted exclusive trade rights in those regions. Okay, and we see here, kind of like the Africa cartoon, same sort of design here. This was a German political cartoon from around 1900, showing China being divided up between the colonial powers. China in the back, telling the Europeans and Japan to scram, get out of here, leave my country alone. But they're all with their knives cutting up the land of China, dividing it up between them. So that term spheres of influence we want to associate mainly with China. Just like other regions of the world, the Chinese didn't just accept that their land was going to be controlled by outsiders. An example of Chinese resistance was the Boxer Rebellion, when Chinese, largely students, they were university students, and people sympathetic to them, rose up against European control. We see here this magazine cover. We see also in this political cartoon where China is represented in this cartoon as the bees coming out of the hive here, and they're attacking the English, the French, the Russians, the Japanese, the colonial powers that had slices of China. And then the last region we're going to here is Japan. And if we think back to Standard 5, we saw Japan from the 16 through the 1800s adopt the policy of isolation. As we mentioned, the United States was also getting involved in the imperialism game, had a lot of interest in the Pacific region, and saw in Japan an opportunity to increase its access to trade and to resources. So in 1853, the American president Millard Fillmore sends this guy, Matthew Perry, on a mission to open the door to trade with Japan. So we want to associate that name, Matthew Perry, with the American effort to begin trade with Japan. We see in a Japanese illustration here, Perry's ship arriving in Japan in 1853. And that concludes what we need to know for Standard 9E.